to you all, and thank you for participating in this very timely webinar organized by the Climate Justice Committee on behalf of Liberal International on the sidelines of the UNFCCC MENA Climate Week in Dubai. I am Hakima Al-Haiti, President of Liberal International, and I'm happy on behalf of Liberal International and the Climate Justice Committee to moderate this panel. We are together for 1 hour, 30 minutes to go through COP26 Glasgow commitment to COP27 Egypt opportunities. We will have a 5-minute update on the work of the Liberal International Climate Justice Committee, following 30 minutes of keynote speeches and then a 30-minute discussion, culminating with 3 to 4 minutes more for each speaker to deliver final remarks. I welcome our audience via Facebook Live and Zoom I ask you to send your questions to our panelists via the comment section on Facebook and the functions on Zoom. And I invite you to engage via social media using the hashtag MENACW22. I will ask all the participants to mute the microphone and to unmute it manually when you have the floor. Today, I'm happy to welcome Rania Al-Mashat, one of the most powerful economists in the MENA region, the first ever former female Minister of Tourism of Egypt, and the current Minister of International Cooperation since December 2019. Madam Minister, thank you for accepting our invitation, and I'm very delighted to have you. We are also happy to welcome Sveinung Rotevatn, the first deputy leader of the Liberal Party of Norway, former Minister of Climate and Environment, former State Secretary for the Ministry of Justice and Public Security, and member of the Norwegian Parliament. Minister Rotevatn, welcome. We are also receiving the former French ambassador for climate change, Stéphane Gompertz, a diplomat who has a particular knowledge of the MENA region. He was in office in Egypt and in Ethiopia, and of course, Ambassador Stéphane was also ambassador in Austria. We have had the opportunity to work together during COP21 and COP22. Welcome, dear Stéphane, we are happy to have you. Last but not least, our Vice Chair of the Liberal International Climate Justice Committee, Susana Ribeiro, Foreign Affairs and Cooperation Advisor at the Secretariat of Climate Action of Catalonia, a fervent defender of sustainability and climate justice. And I would love to ask her, before giving the floor to our outstanding speakers, I will ask you, Susana, to brief all of us on the work of the Climate Justice Committee and on how this work can help to advance the climate agenda. Susana, you have the floor, but very briefly. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for the opportunity to explain you about the mission and activities of the Climate Justice Committee. This committee was created in 2018 to deliver a liberal answer to climate change, and in particular to set a liberal agenda on climate justice. It is noteworthy that the Climate Justice Committee is one of the first global political movements aiming to unite liberals on such an urgent matter as the climate crisis. Since its inception, we have been working on different flagship initiatives. The Climate Justice Principle was the first document to be adopted, setting the tone and the policy stand of the members of the Climate Justice Committee. It established the liberal standpoint on the most recent and urgent aspects and around protecting the environment and mitigate and adapting to climate change. We also have developed a policy lab on climate-induced migration, exploring the topic and developing a common position within Liberal International, as well as a concrete call to action, followed by a public campaign. This is called climate displacement and calls for the creation of an effective international framework to support climate-induced migrants and suggests a climate justice pathway that links human rights to social and economic human development by safeguarding the rights of displaced people, and proposes as well concrete policy recommendations for improvement. Lately, we have been working on a comprehensive study, which is still on its final stages, on the missing links between the environment and the human rights. Following the great job initiated by President of Liberal International, Mrs. Hakima El Haité, and also President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, Mr. Rick Dimes, the Climate Justice Committee embarked on a journey together with representatives from Liberal International Human Rights Committee and the ALDE political group at the PACE in developing a piece of work that highlights the essential obligation and responsibilities of countries and other duty bearers, including business, and their implications for climate agreements, policies, and actions. Climate justice requires that climate action is consistent with the existing human rights. And this piece of work attempts to articulate a common liberal voice on the intersections between the human rights and the environment, looking at science and evidence-based reasoning why our individual rights are linked to the planet's ecosystems. It also aims at eliciting a paradigm shift, elevating the environmental concerns from the policy issue level to the status to establish fundamental right and positioning right holders in order to ensure they fully exercise this fundamental right. At the end, it draws a roadmap on where Liberal International could bring this fight, taking a stand for the right to a safe, healthy, and sustainable environment, strengthening governance, and the environmental rule of law at all levels. Also, last but not least, the Climate Justice Committee plans to develop a policy lab on protecting ecosystems and biodiversity. We want to also develop a joint work with the Liberal International Fair Trade Working Group on transforming economic models and advocating for sustainable finance within the WTO. And of course, we are continuing our strong presence at COPs and other major conferences and events. So thank you again for the opportunity to share all this information with you.
Thank you so much, Susanna. Very nicely summarized. Thank you so much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. After COP22 held in Morocco in 2016, the climate convention is coming back to Africa. COP27 will be held in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, from the 7th of November to the 18th of November. A great opportunity for Africa. I will recall that Africa is emitting only 4% of the global CO2 emissions, but is already paying the bill of climate change consequences on a daily basis. Heat waves, water scarcity, land degradation, floods, climate disaster, etc., etc. So many factors at the origin of food insecurity, conflict, and migration. Sharm el-Sheikh is then the perfect meeting point to deliver on the aspect concerning the financing of adaptation, loss and damage, and the increase of the ambitions of the biggest emitters to mitigate the effect of climate change in the world and in Africa in particular. We all know that the world still remains off track to avert climate crisis and to keep the objective alive, the objective of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We all know that the world remains off track despite deals made in Glasgow to cut carbon and methane emissions and deforestation, phase down coal, and a renewed pledge of financing for poor countries most vulnerable to extreme weather. For many observers, I would say that 3 big ticket items were not realized in Glasgow. Renewing target for 2030 that align with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C, even on the financial commitment, which was very expected by the most vulnerable and which was postponed to 2023, and an agreement on accepting the phase. Minister Mashat to achieve what Glasgow failed in? What will make COP27, in your opinion, a success? And what objectives are expected to be achieved? And finally, what are the challenges on the road to COP27? Minister Al-Mashat, please, you have the floor, and thank you for your participation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hakima, and it's a pleasure to join you and the honorable guests on this call. Three key messages from COP in Egypt. Number one, it's going to be impartial, even though it's in Africa, and we're going to be calling for several issues, but again, impartiality is extremely important. Second, adaptation and resilience, and I think that was one of the outcomes from COP26. And then third, and very, very important, is from pledges and commitments to action. And maybe one significant outcome from Glasgow was the presence of the private sector. And we heard from Secretary Kerry with the private sector participation, we're going from billions to trillions. However, the negotiators are the ones that crack the numbers and try and figure out the pledges. But what's very important for countries is thinking about how we can actually operationalize whatever is being pledged. The countries that need the financing the most are countries rated B and below. They are the ones that are not the emitters, but they have to actually meet certain criteria and so forth. So what is extremely important is to try and see how we can actually de-risk this private investment, this private will of investment in green projects. And this comes with the consolidated and collective effort of everyone, particularly the international institutions, the multilateral development banks and philanthropists and so forth, who can de-risk this private capital and actually create opportunities for blended and innovative financing tools. So I think that is an ambition that we have. How can we actually move from the commitment to operations on the ground, to real projects on the ground? A few excuses that are usually put on the table: there are not enough investable projects, or capacity is quite weak in the countries that need it the most. Nonetheless, for us to overcome this challenge, because it will continue to be there if we just talk about it and not take action, is to actually see how we can create a pool of grants to raise capacity for the countries that need it, how we can leverage on successful examples in countries to be able to replicate it in other countries. And let me take the opportunity to explain or to highlight what we have been doing in Egypt, because since we're hosting the COP and we are in Africa, we have a very extensive portfolio with our multilateral development banks and bilaterals. Our official development assistance portfolio is $26 billion. So it's not a small portfolio. And we did an exercise, which is quite novel in nature. We mapped our ODA financing portfolio to the SDGs. And SDG 13, the climate change SDG, has $11.8 billion. And it's split into adaptation and mitigation projects, which have been done in collaboration with the international community. Adaptation takes 2.8 billion and mitigation 7.8 billion. As you can see, there is a little bit of skewness towards mitigation. So what we are saying in this exercise is we should not forget our SDG agenda, and climate is part of that. And with the international community, if a country has a vision, if a country takes structural reform measures to invite the private sector, you can actually move your green transition forward. But nonetheless, just to conclude and give others space, to move from commitments to action and implementation requires collective action of all stakeholders. And stakeholders are the government that needs to do structural reforms to be able to invite the private capital and create an opportunity for innovative and blended finance. It's the private sector that needs to tell us explicitly how it is willing or how much it requires to create that de-risking so that it could come into the countries that need it the most. Multilateral development banks and bilaterals and all the green institutions to basically tell us what is the percentage of concessionality that can be put in adaptation projects or mitigation projects to be able to invite that capital. And then the new group are the philanthropists, because they are coming in with big money in the green transition, but also how we can create a governance structure to entice them to be part of this implementation process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. I would like to tell you about what we have done in COP22. We have launched the Marrakesh Partnership. This is a platform which is gathering all together state actors, non-state actors, private sector, business, philanthropists, etc. And I know that the UK presidency has improved and refreshed this Marrakesh Partnership and work with this governance mechanism to gather all the participants around action and to gather to impulse action in the field of climate change project. So I think that this mechanism, or I will say institutional mechanism, because it's under the UNFCCC, is already existing, and that's and maybe Egypt can use this mechanism to continue the work with all the sectorial coalitions. They know very well the Marrakesh Partnership, and they worked since 2016, they worked with this tool within the UNFCCC. Thank you so much, Minister. I missed some of your intervention because of the sound, but I guess that I will have more information during the question. I would like to inform the participant and the audience that Minister Al-Mashat will leave in 40 minutes. So if you have any question to address to him, please do it now so that she can answer before leaving. Now, I will hand over the floor to our dear friend from Norway, Minister Rotevatn. Could you please tell us what is your evaluation of the achievement of COP26 and what is the role of Norway in supporting developing countries, especially in the MENA region, in delivering and achieving their climate ambitions? Minister Sveinung, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to contributing to this very important discussion. What is my evaluation of the achievements of COP26? Well, I was asked the question many times ahead of the COP, what will be a success? And I always made sure to underline that if your criteria for success is that all the world's leaders come together and we all decide to get rid of all fossil fuels tomorrow, well, then COP26 will certainly not be a success because no leaders have that mandate. So you have to see things in perspective. And in light of what was achievable and which mandates came to the table, I certainly believe that COP26 was a success. And why is that? Well, the way I see it, we had three important things that needed to be done at COP26. The first was to finish the rule book from Paris. The second was to increase ambition. And the third was to have sufficient commitments to increase climate finance. And the way I see it, COP26 was a success on all three counts. Of course, things could have always been more ambitious and gone even further, but I think in light of where we were at that point, I think we made progress, and that is the most important thing. And also, I think it's worth noting that after 2 years of a global pandemic, where we've had a extreme health crisis all over the world, which has been on top of the agenda in basically every country, we haven't lost sight of the more long-term crisis, which is the climate and nature crisis. So let me just make a few comments to each of those achievements from the COP. Well, first, on the rule book. I was myself, as the Norwegian climate minister at the time, tasked by the COP26 presidency to lead the negotiations ahead of the COP to get an agreement on the rulebook, and more specifically, to get an agreement on Article 6, which is the thing that was left out in Paris, and where you need to find a common framework for being able to finance emission cuts in other countries. That was the one big thing missing from Paris. And I did a lot of work along with my colleague from Singapore in getting an agreement on that. So the COP presidency took the ball when we got to Glasgow, and they managed to make a compromise that, in my view, is acceptable. So now we have a finished rulebook in Article 6, and that's very important to make sure that countries can increase their ambitions and help each other reach their climate targets. The second thing that we needed to achieve, and perhaps the most important thing, was to increase ambition. Because we all know that to be able to get to below 2 degrees and down towards 1.5 degrees, all countries need to do more. And the pledges that were made in Paris were not enough. And hence, we needed all countries, and especially the big emitting countries, to enhance their NDCs, as they're called, or nationally determined contributions, that is, to set more ambitious goals. And we managed to do that. And most countries enhanced their NDCs. The US, back in the agreement, presented a new climate target. My country did the same, the European Union, China, and others. Of course, a lot of these countries should have promised even more, but we managed to move ahead. We managed to get more ambition on the table, and that was very important to, as the presidency would say, keep 1.5 degrees alive. Now, these NDCs need to be enhanced every 5 years, so we need to do more in the next coming years, but I think this was probably the best we could hope for at this point. The third thing was to make sure that especially the developing world could have confidence in the promises on climate finance. Because even though a lot of climate finance has been pledged and delivered over the past 5 years, we have not seen a full delivery of the pledges that were made. And to make sure that there was still confidence between countries and parties going forward, new pledges needed to be made. And a lot of, especially industrialized countries, including my own, but also countries like Canada, Germany, the United Kingdom, etc., promised to double their climate finance. And I think that's very important. And the US, of course. Now, a lot of countries are doubling from low levels and need to do more, but still, pledges were made, and I think those were well received at the summit. And that was also very important. So I think, judging from where we came from, COP26 was a success. But this is ongoing work. We need to do more in the future, and every COP, every year, needs to be a success. To answer the second question, what is Norway's role in supporting developing countries? Norway is, as most of you probably know, a rather small country in the world, but also a very wealthy country. And we have, at least from my party's perspective, always tried to do more on the international stage. We feel a commitment to contribute substantially on the global stage and to contribute funding. Also, climate funding. We have been one of the top contributors over many years. And as I mentioned briefly, we also promised to double our commitments at COP26. And hopefully we will deliver. I said hopefully because my party isn't in government anymore. We lost the election this fall. So now we have a new government. But they have also stood by this pledge, and we will keep them to it in the future. We have especially contributed to certain ends when it comes to climate finance. For example, we have over many years been the by far biggest contributor to the preservation of tropical rainforests, and we've launched and managed successful projects in almost all tropical rainforest countries, including the biggest ones like Indonesia and Brazil, but also Gabon, Guyana, Colombia, etc. So this has been a project where we have especially contributed funding, but also we contribute funding to a wide spectrum of projects, both when it comes to mitigation projects, which are still very important, but also adaptation. And we see the calls for funding for adaptation increasing by the increasing temperatures every year. And that is very understandable, because climate change isn't something we are trying to prevent, because climate change is already here. What we are trying to prevent is climate change getting completely out of hand. But we still have to deal with the climate change that is already happening and that will be happening in the future. And we see devastating consequences in a lot of countries when it comes to desertification, when it comes to more extreme weather, floods, droughts. And this has severe consequences, especially for food supply, for energy, for infrastructure. So increasing finance in the next years when it comes to adaptation measures in developing countries has to be central. It has to be key. And Norway is also committed to contributing substantial funding in that direction over the next few years. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you. And we'll hopefully get back to some good questions.
Yeah, I will be back to you through the questions. Thank you, Minister Rotevatn. And I will hand the floor to Ambassador Stéphane, and then I have many questions for you. Stéphane, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, dear Hakima. It's wonderful to be with you again, to work with you again. My experience is more remote than the experience of other speakers, because I was indeed Special Envoy for Africa and the Middle East for COP21, but that's already a long time ago. But I'd like to stress in the beginning that it was a very enlightening experience, and I think the institution of Special Envoys, one in each region of the world, was quite positive. I don't know if Egypt intends to do the same, but we managed to, I went to 29 different countries in Africa and the Middle East, and I had contacts with heads of state, ministers, but also people in the street, people, ordinary people, and it was all very enlightening. I think it was very useful to help our government follow the situation closely and prepare for the conference adequately. On one particular instance, the idea proved to be very particularly useful. You remember that on the last day of COP21, one Latin American country was tempted to block the adoption of the Paris Agreement by consensus. And my colleague, who was in charge of Latin America, persuaded our then President Hollande, to call one of his colleagues, actually President Castro from Cuba, to persuade the said country not to block the consensus. So it was a modest, but I think quite useful contribution to the success of the conference. This being said, I have unfortunately the impression that the overall political climate is less favorable than it was at the time of the Paris conference, also at the time of the Marrakesh conference, due to all the tensions that have raised. I remember after the when the Paris Agreement was reached, the comments made by Obama and Xi Jinping echoed each other. Obama said the Paris Agreement establishes the enduring framework the world needs to solve the climate crisis. And Xi Jinping said that the Paris Agreement has charted a clear course for global cooperation on coping with climate change. Global cooperation now, where has global cooperation gone? We hear, unfortunately, different noises. And my impression is that Egyptian friends will have a particularly difficult task ahead. I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but it will be difficult indeed. Now, I know that Egypt has a very rich diplomatic experience. At the time of the Paris negotiation of the Paris Agreement, Egypt was chairing the committee of head of state and government of African countries, CAHOSC, and also the conference of African ministers on the environment, and did a very, very good job. Now, obviously, Egypt will be in the forefront, and it starts with even more difficult. I'd like to venture, sorry, it might sound not sound very diplomatic, but I would like to suggest that one of the tasks we all face, not only Egypt as chair, but all the participating countries, will be to help persuade governments and public opinions that we have to look ahead. We have to look to the future and go beyond and see beyond tensions. Let's just take a few examples. I will not mention the terrible war in Ukraine, but obviously we all have that in mind. Let's just a few words about Yemen. Can you imagine the cost, the human cost, more than 370,000 casualties of the war in Yemen, the number of billions of dollars spent on the war in Yemen, which money that could be used to help address the challenges of climate change. Now, clearly, I know Egypt has a lot of diplomatic clout, and one of the probably one of the challenges Egypt will face will be to try and push for solutions. Let's take another example, Iran. In Glasgow, the Iranian delegation said that Iran would not ratify the Paris Agreement unless sanctions, international sanctions against Iran are lifted. Now we hear reassuring voices saying that perhaps an agreement is close at hand. Let's hope it will be the case, not only for the Iranians, for the Iranian population, not only for the world at large, but also for our common action against the climate change. So our efforts will have to go beyond the area of the fight against climate change, but try and heavily diffuse tensions. Apart from that, I don't want to be too long, but I think that my feeling is that as we did in Paris, as we did in Marrakesh and the other COPs, we will have to continue to promote good practices, and especially in the field of adaptation. I'd just like to mention a few examples. One is architecture, building. We know that building can contribute a lot to preventing the effects of climate change. I was very interested to see a few days ago that an architect from Burkina Faso, Francis Diebebo Kéré, received on the 15th of March the Pritzker Prize, because he imagined endeavored to build houses using traditional material, earth, but also stone and wood, and build low-cost housing, which also help prevent the heat. And this remembered me of a fascinating experience I had when I was posted in Egypt, when I discovered the architecture of Hassan Fathy, who died in 1989. He built houses with mud bricks. I know there is a Hassan Fathy Prize, which was launched by the Library of Alexandria. I hope that this prize will be popularized and that the example will be followed elsewhere. Another example, another instance where adaptation can also make a lot of progress, and obviously everybody knows about it, is drip irrigation. All countries, and particularly Egypt, but also others, have endeavored to develop drip irrigation, which helps diminish the use of water. The last area where I think a lot of progress can still be achieved, and there countries like Morocco have a lead, is the use of solar energy. It has an effect both obviously on mitigation and on adaptation. And many countries of the region, of the MENA region, have made a lot of progress in the field of solar energy. And I remember at the time when I visited Saudi Arabia, for instance, I was told about the King Abdullah initiative for solar power desalination. Also, so very interesting examples in Kuwait. Morocco obviously has endeavored to reach 52% of the energy mix given by renewables by 2030, and so on and so forth. So there, I hope that the Sharm el-Sheikh COP will also give a new impetus and give a new lead. Iran, I mentioned Iran already. I was particularly struck by the case of Iran when I visited the country. I've visited Iran several times. I mentioned the sanctions, but Iran is also a very.
I lost you.
Can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah. Well, the connection is not perfect. Iran suffers from dust winds. And this, and I'm going back to what I said at the beginning, this is due, they told me when I was there, largely to some of the action taken by Saddam Hussein during the war between Iran and Iraq, when he destroyed the swamps. So I don't want to be too long. I just like to stress that certainly the will is there, the know-how, the technical capacity are present, but the success of Sharm el-Sheikh will to a very large extent depend on the political will to go beyond current crisis and look to the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stéphane. You know, I'm listening to you and to Minister Sveinung. I was wondering, I'm generally always very optimistic, you know, and you know me very well, but after COP26, I said, okay, this is, that might be qualified like a this is the first time we are opening the door to this out and then face down. And this is the ever time we did have this discussion during the inside the arena for to assess their contributions and the ambitions. The problem for me is that this is the after the latest report of the IPCC, the alarming report of the IPCC, I was really wondering if we can keep alive the 1.5 degrees C goal within reach, and this is what I hope. But we are not acting. We heard a lot of pledges, and I hope that we will deliver on some of them in Egypt, and I'm confident that the Egyptians diplomats are very strong to push and to advance this agenda. But the latest report of the IPCC make me a little bit confused about if we can achieve or not achieve the goal, the 1.5 degrees C. Let me come back to Minister.
Hakima?
Hakima, you're muted.
On one hand, and on the second hand, this is also organized while the latest and the alarming IPCC report was talking about the urgency to act now. So how will COP27 and what will be the approach of Asia Egypt is importing 70 to 80% of its wheat from Ukraine, and this is the same situation for many African countries. So what will be the strategy of Egypt to make this COP really successful and to minimize the impact of what we are seeing now, these geostrategical turbulences on the achievement and the goals of COP27? And my second question will be, how will the Egyptian presidency Hello?
Well, Hakima, your voice got cut off several times, so let me try and respond before I go on a few things. I want to thank Ambassador Stéphane for his interventions, and just on the diplomatic course, the president of COP is our Minister of Foreign Affairs. So that definitely helps in terms of trying to weigh all the trade-offs, and so that's one comment. The other comment is on the Hassan Fathi. You just gave me a very good idea to try and see if we can also create something during COP to basically show how good, because everybody's talking about cities and the importance of green cities and making sure that we try to create sustainability, so that construction or that building material is very useful when it comes to climate. Hakima, the global backdrop is very different than where we were in December or in November of last year. And I think that the whole world is currently dealing with the unraveling of the second round effects from the Ukraine-Russia crisis. So, even developed economies are being affected by the increase in oil prices and their implications on food prices and transportation and so forth. So there's not a single country saved or off the brink. Even monetary and fiscal policies globally are trying to figure out what to do to try and mitigate the impacts. And conventional policies will not be enough, because we have a compounded and multiple shock that is taking place: commodity prices, food prices, and then most importantly, related to the financing, there's so much uncertainty. So private capital trying to locate from one place to the other at a time when we need to push the green transition, that in itself is a very new challenge. So I think that all of these are topics which are being discussed extensively now, and in the few sessions that I have attended here, for example, it comes up, but it doesn't come up in a context that you are proposing. But I'm sure that there will be no discussion void of these recent impacts and how they affect. But it brings to the forefront, very importantly, adaptation. I mean, agricultural products, trying to push also regional integration. All of the topics that were so important before COVID, but got sort of, I don't want to say put aside, but priorities shifted. The health issue was quite important, and trying to mitigate the impacts on economies. So in any event, just to conclude, we look forward to partnering with the different stakeholders to push the agenda and making it as successful as all of us hope. And again, from commitments to implementation, that is sort of what we are working with our different colleagues and partners to push for. Thank you.
Minister, I have two questions for you before you leave. One is, what is the role played by the African Union in COP27, and is the African Union involved in COP27? And the second one is the Egypt presidency championing the Great Green Wall in Africa? This is an initiative which was created in 2007 and which is now championed by the African Union.
I mean, of course, the African Union is an important partner in general, and again, our COP is like any other COP is very inclusive, When you take a look at what happened in Glasgow, everybody was involved, and I'm sure that in this COP, everyone will be involved as well. On the green wall, I don't have a direct comment, just because it has not come up in our, or maybe I do not know all the details around it, but I'm sure that all initiatives that are meant to push the green transition in Africa will be sort of showcased.
Thank you. Thank you. Minister Rotevatn, do I pronounce correctly your name? Rotevatn.
Yeah, it's pretty close, Rotevatn.
Rotevatn, thank you. What will be the consequences on the energy sector, independently from the increase of the bill, on the actual situation? Is it affecting the climate agenda? I heard two theses. People saying yes, it will make faster the green transition, and others saying no, that will be the opposite. It will postpone the green transition. What do you think, Minister? And I will put the same question to Stéphane.
Just to clarify, with the current situation, you're alluding to the security crisis, the Ukraine war.
The invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yes.
So how the actual situation is affecting the climate agenda? What thesis are you for? Is it a speedy green transition, because the developed country and the European country will not want to depend on Russian gas, and they will develop renewables, or they will use coal instead of renewable, and we will not advance the climate agenda? What will be the situation in your opinion?
I think in the very short term, you might have an increase in the use of fossil fuels and emissions, because the wish to gain energy independence from Russia will mean, or it could mean, that, for example, coal power plants in certain European countries that were planned on being shut down aren't at the timetable that the plans were set for. But I think that is very short term. I think in the medium term, the rightful ambitions to gain energy independence from Russia, which is abundantly clear that is needed, will increase to a sped up energy transition into green energy. I think that is without a doubt, because I think this will make sure that a lot of renewable projects are put on a high-speed track, wind, solar, hydro, you name it. So I think you will see a massive build-out of renewables in Europe over the next couple of years, even faster than what has been projected. And that will, I guess, will have to be a good thing for Europe, both when it comes to energy independence and climate change. And I think this situation has shown us the danger of being dependent on fossil fuels being exported from authoritarian countries. And Russia is not the only authoritarian country that exports fossil fuels. In fact, most countries that export fossil fuels are authoritarian countries, be they China or Saudi Arabia or Qatar or others. There are, in fact, very few stable democracies that produce a lot of fossil fuels. Norway happens to be one of them, Canada is another, but there aren't that many. So energy independence and renewables isn't just good for climate, it's also good for your security. And I think that is a lesson that European leaders have certainly learned over the past couple of weeks.
Minister, do you think that the current crisis will serve as an excuse for the leaders to postpone the appointment of 2030 to increase their ambitions?
I don't think so, at least not in Europe. I mean, I know the European...
the pandemic was used to postpone the commitment on finance, until 2023. So we are wondering what will be the position now towards the climate agenda?
I don't think that it will affect the climate goals that have been put out from the different European countries, at least. And I don't think the European Green Deal will be postponed either. I think you will have a sped up transition. Perhaps the reason why some, at least, are alluding to and also actually postponing climate finance might be that a number of countries, when they have increased expenditures to host refugees, which is happening now all over Europe. We have the worst refugee crisis since the Second World War, millions of Ukrainians on the run. A lot of countries, when they accept refugees and deal with refugee crisis, they take that from the international aid budget. And that is also to a certain degree accepted under OECD rules for international development aid. So I think that might be the reason why you're seeing that effect. But if that effect is indeed real, it's my opinion that it needs to be very short term, because we need to get climate finance moving. I will push for that in my country, and I hope other liberal parties will push for that in their countries, because the climate crisis is just as real and just as serious, even though we now have a security crisis in Europe.
Do you think that we will deliver on the financial commitment in COP27 as promised in COP26?
I certainly hope so.
We hope so. Stéphane, I remember that when we were together in COP22, the figures of the CO2 emission were in 2015, 3.7 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of this century. Then in COP21, the trajectory was reduced to 2.7 degrees C. In Glasgow, it was Glasgow cut the trajectory further to 2.4 degrees Celsius. What is needed to be done to ensure that we keep alive the 1.5 degrees C by the end of this century, Stéphane?
Well, an awareness of what the world will be for our children and our grandchildren. We have to look ahead. I totally agree with what the minister just said about the difference between short-term and long-term effects of the current crisis. In the short term, indeed, it is to be feared that countries, industries will again use more fossil fuels than was envisaged before, due to the shortage and the rising prices of oil and natural gas. In the long run, I think that the willingness to ensure independence will have a positive effect on our energy policies. There's one issue which I'd like to mention, though, and you won't be surprised to hear a Frenchman raising the issue, and not everybody will agree with me, obviously. It is the question of the nuclear energy. What future is there for nuclear energy? As you know, in France and other countries, we advocate the use of nuclear energy because we think that without nuclear energy, it will be impossible to reach the target, Hakima, you just mentioned. Now, there are a lot of controversies, including in our countries, and especially in the framework of the forthcoming presidential election. But like I think the majority of French people, I'm convinced that we cannot do without nuclear energy. There are certainly risks, and we've seen that during the recent tragic events in Ukraine when the Russians took over the Chernobyl plant. But altogether, we think that the dangers of nuclear energy are much lower as the danger of climate change. I'll try and sum it up by saying that if there is a nuclear disaster, which is a possibility, how long could its effects last? Quite long, actually. The plutonium's half-life is more or less 12,000 years. So we can reckon that if there is a real tragedy, nuclear tragedy, effects could last for 20 to 30,000 years. A disaster, yes. But if we have to live with temperatures higher, 2-3 degrees higher than now, how long will it last? 300,000 years, 500,000 years? So we have to take time into account. And this is one of the reasons why don't want to be too long, but one of the reasons why we think that we cannot address the issue of climate change without taking into account the possible usefulness of nuclear energy. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Stéphane. You know that for many years, it was rather impossible to talk about two things under the UNFCCC arena, nuclear and coal. That was something which was shame. We were not discussing about that. Now that's right. The French opened the door to talk about nuclear, but let me tell you something. I am not a pro-nuclear lady, but I think that we can do a lot by energy efficiency. If we work on energy efficiency and we want to change the world, because the Paris Agreement is about a global transformation with the change of the production way, and method, the consumption method, the construction, the agriculture, etc., etc. Everything has to change, and this is the global revolution. If we want to really to change, we should not think about nuclear, because you look at what is happening now. Imagine in Ukraine, and all of us, we are very I will not say afraid, but all the humanity is threatened by a small gesture of Mr. Putin towards the Ukrainian base of nuclear energy. Anyway, I think that we should more focus on the climate agenda and the energy transition, a fair energy transition, because I heard that in Europe, you have qualified gas as a clean energy. This is what I heard in the EU. And I was wondering, what are we going to do with, for example, the most vulnerable countries who are producing fossil fuel energy? Are we going to ask them to stop and to use renewable, and the developed country will continue to use fossil fuel? How do you imagine a fair energy transition? This is a question for both of you, Minister and Ambassador. Minister Rotevatn. Yes, Minister Rotevatn, you are unmuted. You are muted. Yeah, please.
Yes. So how I just to specify how I envisage a fair transition.
Yeah.
Well, I think the issue of a fair transition or a just transition, as some say, has come to the forefront in the recent years, both on a global level and in every nation state. And I think those are somewhat different issues. Nationally, we have this debate in my country, and that is about, of course, making sure that when you, for example, increase taxation on pollution, which is a necessary tool to have a quick transition, you make sure that that doesn't unproportionally damage the people with lower incomes, and that you have equalization measures, and you compensate people, and you find ways of supporting people through the transition, which we have done in many respects, for example. So that is one discussion. On a global level, which perhaps is the most interesting one in this aspect, we'll talk about climate finance. That is a necessary tool. There are a number of countries who have a rightful need and wish to finance both mitigation measures and adaptation measures. And the countries who have the thickest wallets and the most money, and the countries who have profited most from climate change need to pay up. So that's very important. Also, we have, even though we don't, we no longer say that some countries need to reduce their emissions and some don't need to reduce at all, and that is a good development. Everyone needs to reduce their emissions. Of course, there are still countries that have legitimate needs when it comes to development, and that are more hesitant to increase rapidly than the countries who have developed further. And I think that's a fair debate. And I don't expect every country in the world to have climate targets where they drastically reduce their emissions in the short term. In some countries, it will be a great progress just to stabilize their emissions and then decrease them. So you need to see where you're coming from. Whereas in countries like my country and most European countries, we can and should reduce our emissions fast and drastically. So of course, people have and countries have different backgrounds and are on different levels of development. So I think that's fair, and that needs to be taken into account in the negotiations. But we all need to contribute, and we are no longer in a situation where some can just take a pass and say that, you know, we don't have to do anything. You guys fix it. Everyone has to be part of the solution, but the solutions in our countries vary somewhat.
Thank you, Stéphane. I have heard President Macron announcing during COP26 that the European institution will not finance any more fossil fuel in installation in outside Europe.
That's right.
That's right. But the problem is that I was waiting for an announcement which is completely the opposite. The Europeans should not invest in fossil fuel in Europe, but still maintain their finance in African countries, because Africa, as I recall, is only polluting 4% of the CO2, emitting 4% of the CO2 emissions. So how can we punish Africa by stopping any investment in the energy, the fossil fuel energy sector, and continue investing in Europe? I was really waiting for the opposite. Can you explain to us?
Well, first of all, I think the idea is to stop investing in fossil fuels altogether. But the fact is that in the past we used to invest in facilities that would indeed promote the use of fossil fuels. You know, I remember a discussion I took part in a couple of years ago when I was dealing with African issues in the ministry, and I was a member of the governing board of the French Development Agency. And the question was whether we should accept to finance a coal facility in a big African country. And at the beginning we said yes, we should do it because they need it. And then we changed our mind and said no, we're not going to do it because it's detrimental to the development of alternative sources of energy in that country. Besides, you will always find people who are, or countries which are ready to invest in such facilities, be it oil or coal. We think that there is a better use for let's say European money, and indeed we should try and focus our investment effort in facilities which help promote a stable and healthy environment. That's true at the level of states. That's also true at the level of the as far as private companies are concerned. I'd just like to give you a personal example. I'm an advisor to an impact investment fund, French impact investment fund, Investisseurs et Partenaires. And we invest in African companies, which obviously have to be profitable because otherwise we would lose our money. But those companies have to produce effects either in the area of the environment or in the social area of governance. So these are the criteria according to which we choose the companies we decide to invest in. And that's true for states as well. the more we invest in healthy sectors, the more we invest, especially in new and renewable energies, the better. So this is why we don't think it would be appropriate to continue to invest, let's say, in coal or oil, be it in Africa or elsewhere in the world. But that's true for the European continent as well. We are closing down our coal plants as well.
Yeah, but and you are exporting.
And we're quite pleased that Poland in Glasgow also pledged to give up coal in the foreseeable future. That's a big step ahead.
Yeah, indeed. Minister, whatever. Any comment?
Well, I can give you one example. Norway, for many years, used to have a development program that we called Oil for Development, which I guess was a program that made sense in its time, because as you probably know, Norway is a big oil and gas producer. And even though that has contributed to climate change, at least we have succeeded in managing our resources and our oil wealth in a rather sustainable way, as opposed to a lot of countries. So for many years, we helped developing countries explore their oil and gas resources and manage them in a smart way. But that was a program that we canceled when I was in government, because these are different times. And helping countries to develop new fossil fuel resources doesn't really make that much sense anymore. And we need to rather help countries develop renewable resources, sustainable resources, as well as doing that and making transition in our own countries. We also launched a big project where one of our government development funds was allowed to spend much more money in investing in renewables in developing countries, which I think can be both good investments that can make good profit, but it's certainly good for climate and the environment. One thing that is oftentimes overlooked in many developing countries is the issue of getting a grid in place, because renewables are profitable and great solutions compared to fossil fuels in very many countries. But still, a lot of countries are hesitant, and that is oftentimes because of the lack of a properly working electrical grid. Because if you need to have a renewable
storage,
because you need unless you build, gigantic battery packs that can be both difficult and expensive. If you are to rely on renewables, you have to have a huge grid spanning different countries, because the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, the rain doesn't always come. And if you are investing in a weather-dependent electrical system and power system, the grid needs to be working. And that is I think, problem that is somewhat under-communicated in especially many African countries. So investing in renewables is great, but investing in a functioning grid is also very important and often a prerequisite for the first.
And it's very difficult for African country who just discovered gas or any fossil fuel research to understand that he needs to switch to renewable while he has gas, and while Europe is buying gas and importing gas from Russia. So I think that we need more coherency and in the international policy of climate change. This is the issue. It's to have a coherent framework within which all of us, we are equal and we are behaving the same way. I have a question from the audience for Minister Rotevatn. As former of the UNEA president, what are your views on how to better interlink and strengthen coherence, coordination and cooperation between biodiversity, climate change and environmental global agenda? That's a question for you, Minister Sveinung.
That is a excellent question. And it's a good reminder that now we have mostly been talking about climate change and the Climate Change Convention, but there are several conventions and they're all important. And especially the Convention on Biological Diversity, for example, where we still need to make a lot of progress. And these things are very interlinked. So when I was president of the UNEA 5 last February, we tried to make the agenda encompassing so that you could include these various aspects because they are interlinked. Climate change is a huge threat to biodiversity and nature. Nature loss is a huge cause of climate change. As talked about tropical forests earlier, that is extremely important. And if we don't preserve the Congo Basin, the Amazon, the great forests of Indonesia, it doesn't really matter what we do when it comes to energy, for example, because then we won't have a chance to stop global warming either way. So these things are interlinked. I think it's obviously hard to succeed the way the questionnaire here wants us to have a perfect coherence, perfect coordination. But I think if there is one arena to cooperate that we need to strengthen, it is UNEA. UNEP is a very important UN agency to work on these issues. UNEA is the only place where the world comes together to discuss both biodiversity, nature, climate loss, etc. The fight against marine pollution, for example. So we need to see these things together, both nationally and globally. And I think UNEA is the best place to do that.
I completely and fully agree with you, together with you, Minister, because I always made this remark that we have so many conventions, and the problem with those conventions is that those are not the same ministers negotiating, not the same negotiators, and not the same financial fund, and not the same agenda. So I personally really agree together with you that UNEA is the best place to interlink all the agendas together and to have an overview and to give perspective to the world about sustainability, climate change, and biodiversity. Yes, I have another question, and it's something similar to what I told you. I hear a lot about greater pledges and more finance, but never hear anything on efficiency and effectiveness of spend. For example, being outcome focused, not process focused. Decisions being made in the right order, projects that combine mitigation, adaptation, as well as well-being and economic resilience. What is that? That is a question from the audience. Who wants to answer? Ambassador?
Well, obviously, it is a very good question. It's impossible to give a general answer. The answer has to be given on the ground, on each project, on each initiative. And I'd like to go back to what the Egyptian minister said, which stressed, which was quite important, namely the involvement of the private sector. This has been an ongoing feature for a long time, and it will continue in Sharm el-Sheikh, and this is very, very encouraging. I might have sounded a bit pessimistic at the beginning because I referred to the ongoing, current crisis in Ukraine, Yemen, and so on and so forth. But there are long-term trends which continue to be positive, and one is the involvement of the private sector, not because industrialists are generous people and benevolent people, but because they see where their long-term interest lies. I'm struck, for instance, by the fact that most oil companies now switch to alternative sources of energies. Just to take the French example, Total, the French, well, it's a multinational group. It's French. It's French originally. Now it's called Total Energy with a plural. Namely, they continue to invest a lot in solar energy, in geothermal, and so on and so forth. Again, not out of generosity, but because it is their ultimate interest. The same is true for car companies. car companies produce more and more either electric or hybrid cars, because they see that ultimately it is their interest, and customers will be more and more interested in cars that cause less pollution, and also at the end of the day become less expensive, especially when the price of oil rises. So this is quite an encouraging factor, and clearly the involvement of private companies might help to make sure that the money is properly invested. Obviously, there might be waste, there might be error, mistakes, but eventually, I think movement will prove itself, will prove to be useful and go in the right direction.
I absolutely agree with you, Stéphane, but you know that private sector needs to have visibility and need to have a signal from the government, and the signal, the right signal is the right policy, the right regulation. If the government is postponing the objective to reach carbon neutrality to 2070, you will have no interest from the private sector to change their production units. So I think that we need to keep to keep optimistic, like Minister Rotevatn, and to make it happen, because climate change is affecting all of us, and we need all to be together, and we need all to change to stop climate change. This is the issue, and we know how the African countries are suffering. And I was talking to Minister Rania of the Great Green Wall in Africa, for example. This is an amazing project that will save millions of people from and alleviate millions of people from poverty, and give hope to the youth in Africa. But the problem is the finance. Will the developed countries and the biggest emitters, will they deliver on the financial promises in Sharm El-Sheikh in Egypt? And when it's done, how will the African countries will have access to these finance? And you know, Stéphane, how complicated are the rules to benefit from funds or finance. So I think that we are coming to the end of this panel. That was, I will give you the floor for 3 minutes.
Just
yes.
1 second. One factor we haven't mentioned, but continues to be very relevant, is the role of cities and local bodies, which have a huge contribution to bring to the fight against climate change. But that would require another hour of discussion.
No, you're right. You are right. You know that 80% of the decisions related to climate are taken in cities. Yes. And cities are very important. Even here in Morocco, we have proposed that we develop a LDC partnership instead of NDC partnership, a local NDC, and the national NDC will be the aggregation of all the local NDCs to impulse the increase of the ambitions nationally. That was the proposal of the local, the intergovernmental organization for local collectivities. But I think that what we need now, we need to maintain the trust in Sharm El-Sheikh. And I was very interested to listen to Minister Rotevatn when he said that he is optimistic, and for him, COP26 was a success. This is not the feeling of all the southern countries, because the southern countries are feeling that the promises were not fulfilled. And we need to maintain the trust, and we need to fulfill them during COP27 in Egypt. Minister Rotevatn, you have 3 minutes to close your remarks.
Well, to follow up on your comment, I will say that more work is needed. There's no doubt about that. And COP26 was not the end station. And there is a lot of promises that need to be kept in COP27, and building mutual trust is key to any successful COP. Well, I think I'll just use my last 3 minutes to try to actually answer the last question, because I think the question was very good on efficiency. Because we have been talking a lot about climate finance, rightfully so, very important topic. But to build trust mutually, we're also dependent on investments being efficient. There's no doubt about that. I think when it comes to mitigation efforts, building trust in efficient investments, succeeding in COP26 with finishing the rulebook on Article 6 was key. That's incredibly important to build trust after the clean development mechanism. We need new mechanisms, and they need to be need to have high integrity, because if they don't have high integrity, you won't get funding and you won't get the trust that is needed. So that was very important. And I think we also need to have high trust and high integrity when it comes to the mitigation investments. And obviously one danger there is that we must make sure that mitigation investments aren't just old fashioned development investments with just a different name, because then it will be difficult to procure the necessary funding. So you need to make sure that the funding you allocate to mitigate to adaptation measures, and you need much more of that, go directly into high integrity projects to help adapt to climate change. That is possible, and there are many such great projects, and that is very important to build mutual trust. And of course, the best thing is to find projects that achieve both mitigation and adaptation, and those projects certainly exist. Of course, preserving forests is perhaps the greatest example of that, with both mitigation and adaptation, but there are also others. I think COP27 has a lot of work ahead of it. It will be difficult, but I am hopeful that we can move even further ahead and build on the results achieved in Glasgow, and make sure that we can reinforce the trust that is needed between countries all over the world to help come together at this very crucial moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Minister. Stéphane, final remarks?
Well, thank you. I don't think I have much to add. The Minister said it all. I think times are difficult, but there are a lot of possibilities. And I think Sharm el-Sheikh COP will be a good opportunity to grasp our long-term interest in the future of our children. So there are still a lot of chances that the conference will be a success if we all join our hands together, both on mitigation and on adaptation. And obviously, we should not forget finance, which is a key, because so far there have been a lot of commitments, but they have not been achieved yet.
Thank you both. Thank you, Minister Al-Mashat. Thank you, Minister Ambassador. And I would like to say, yes, we need hope and we need trust. And you are right, Minister, that we need to keep hope. And I hope that COP27 will be a success and will deliver the promises, not only promises of Paris. Vulnerable countries are waiting for the developed world to fulfill those promises in Sharm el-Sheikh. That will be this will be a COP in Africa, and in Africa, I think that we need to change the narrative of adaptation, because when we adapt, we also mitigate. we are creating wells of carbon sequestration. So I think that the developed world should be interested also to invest in adaptation, to not only to support the most vulnerable to adapt themselves to climate change, but to create more well of sequestration of CO2 emissions, like you said, Minister, when you are giving the example with the forest. So thank you so much for your participation. It's indeed a very grave moment of our common history. And I think that the world will take benefit of this crisis to foster the participation, and hope to see you soon before Sharm el-Sheikh to organize our participation in COP27. Thank you, Minister Rotevatn. Thank you, Ambassador. Susanna, thank you for your help and your support and the great job within the Climate Justice Committee. Thank you, Andrea, Jason. Good day to all of you.